Hello, and welcome to our webinar on meltdowns and shutdowns. My name's Lizzy, and I'm going to be your trainer for today. This session is provided to you by Mind, the mental health charity, but I actually work for a project called Aspie Trainers. And what's special about our group is that we're all actually autistic adults designing and delivering training for parents and carers, professionals and people in the workplace. So we're really thrilled that Mind has given us this opportunity to share our first person perspective and our unique lived experience of what it's like for autistic people experiencing meltdowns and shutdowns. If you want to find more about Aspie Trainers, you'll find us on Facebook, and we have our own website. We run numerous training, but Mind is one of our biggest customers. So you may well have seen me before if you've attended any Zoom training with them in the last year or two. This slide is something that we cover in all of our training courses, because terminology, or the way in which we label autism and autistic people, can really vary. Of course, the diagnostic manuals evolve over time. And the most recent iteration of those diagnostic manuals states that anybody diagnosed today will be given a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. And that's an umbrella condition that captures all of the individual diagnoses that people may have received in the past. Things like Asperger's, which I was diagnosed with, or maybe more classic autism. Now, Aspie Trainers is a very inclusive organisation. We recognise that the way in which people talk about their autism is very much influenced by the medical professionals that they've been exposed to, the educational professionals that they work with at school or college, the books that they've read, the videos that they've watched, the research that they've done. So we encourage people to use the terminology and the language that they feel really comfortable with. Some people, like myself, say that I'm autistic. Other people will say that they have autism. At Aspie Trainers, we don't think there's a right or wrong way. We do, however, tend to think of autism as a condition rather than a disorder. And the reason for that is that disorder is a very medicalised term. It suggests that there's something wrong with us, that we're in a deficit in some way. And we don't believe that that's actually the case. Which brings me on to two of the additional terms towards the bottom of the slide. I'd like to kind of start at the bottom and work up, if that's okay. So you'll see there the word neurodiversity, or ND. Now, under the social model of disability, the neurodiversity movement kind of came together because individuals were looking at all of these different variations in the human brain, these neurological differences that people are born with, autism obviously being a significant one, but others that you will probably be familiar with include ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and Tourette's. And under the neurodiversity model, what we believe is that each of those neurological differences should be recognised and respected as a natural part of human variation as we evolve. And just like people have different skin colour or eye colour or different body shape, people have different types of brain. So I, for example, as an autistic adult, have a differently wired brain to somebody who is neurotypical, which takes us to the other word a little further up on the slide. So neurotypical, or NT, just means somebody of the majority neurotype. Most human beings are born with a similar type of brain. So on the courses that we run, we will often talk about the neurotypical experience versus the autistic or the neurodiverse experience, because as a result of our neurological differences, we see and experience the world differently. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. So those are the things that I want you to bear in mind as we go through the training today. So the topic is meltdowns and shutdowns, but there are some specific objectives that I want to cover with you. So what we're going to do first is look at the difference between a meltdown, a shutdown, and a temper tantrum. So we've got some good clarity. Then we're going to look at how having a meltdown or a shutdown can typically impact an autistic person. We're going to look at the factors that contribute to autistic people experiencing meltdowns and shutdowns. We're going to look at ways that you can reduce the likelihood of meltdowns or shutdowns. And we will also look at ways to support autistic people during and after a meltdown or a shutdown. So hopefully by the end of the next kind of 2 hours, you will have a much more comprehensive idea of what it is to experience these different types of intense emotional reaction, and how to best support the autistic people in your lives, whether you're working with them on a professional basis or supporting them as a parent or carer. So meltdowns and shutdowns, what they have in common is that they are both intense responses to overwhelming situations. That moment when you kind of reach tipping point, when everything is just too much and our bodies react in a certain way. Now, both of the responses to a meltdown and a shutdown are characterised by a temporary loss of behavioural control. And that's really important for people to understand, because often autistic people are stigmatised and thought badly of as a result of the meltdowns and the behaviour that they demonstrate during a meltdown. There's very much a misconception that as children and young people grow up, that they shouldn't be having meltdowns anymore. And I can tell you, as a grown-up 46-year-old with a husband and 2 autistic sons, that we definitely do still have meltdowns. And of course, through life experience and time and understanding our own triggers and needs, I am able to minimize to an extent the frequency of my meltdowns, but it's not something that I'm ever going to be able to eradicate, because it's part of the autistic experience. What I can do is try and minimize the impact on other people around me. And the other interesting thing about meltdowns and shutdowns is that they can happen in isolation, or they can be followed one after the other. So you may find that an individual that you are with has a very intense meltdown experience, and then afterwards, as a result of emotional overwhelm and exhaustion, they go into shutdown. Or you may find that somebody bypasses the meltdown stage and goes straight into shutdown and retreats into themselves because everything is just too much for them to cope with and they need that time to recover. We'll look at that in a lot more detail this morning. Now, I should have explained at the beginning, but I'm a late diagnosed autistic. So I was brought up as a neurotypical. Looking back, it was very obvious from a young age that I was autistic, but it simply wasn't picked up on by my family or by school. And interestingly, I wasn't actually diagnosed until I was 42. And that was as a result of my oldest son. His first 2 years at school were characterised by frequent meltdowns, complete sensory overwhelm, and he was regularly being restrained and excluded. And I, of course, didn't know anything about autism at that point, didn't know what was going on, was desperately worried about him, and really didn't understand why school had been such a trigger for this extremely angry behaviour that he was presenting for the most part. A couple of years down the line, by the time he was 6, he was officially diagnosed with autism. And at that point, I decided to learn everything I possibly could about the condition, because I wanted to be able to support him absolutely as best as possible. And the more I read and the more I learned, and the courses that I went on, the penny kind of dropped that, hang on, I'm autistic too. And my whole kind of life fell into place. And I often say to people that the moment I was diagnosed, for me, it was overwhelmingly positive, because it was like being handed the rule book to my brain, or the instruction manual that said, you know, this is who you are and this is how you work. And it started to explain all of my life experiences up to that point. And in particular, where in the past growing up, I'd been called difficult, over emotional, I was too angry, too hot-headed, selfish, reactionary, weird, all of those kind of things that I was called because of the very intense meltdowns that I was experiencing, which to an onlooker would seem very over the top and unnecessary, for me were completely out of my control. And meltdowns are ugly. So yeah, I would say that meltdowns are the really ugly part of autism, because you will see us at our worst. all human beings can behave badly in difficult situations, all human beings, for any multitude of reasons. But for an autistic individual, whatever the trigger is to the meltdown, the behavior that you'll see, the crying, the screaming, the pleading for help, maybe violence outwardly towards other people or inwardly towards themselves, or destruction of property, smashing things, breaking things, tearing things. It's a horrible and frightening experience for the observer, but just imagine what it's like for the person going through that at the time and then coming out the other side and realizing what they've done and how they're going to be judged by others. So meltdowns are an ugly thing to experience from everybody who is impacted's perspective. But what's really important is so that autistic people aren't judged and marginalized and labeled as over the top and attention seeking and difficult or violent, angry, is that we start to understand why meltdowns are so very different from a temper tantrum, and that meltdowns genuinely aren't within our control. When we look at a temper tantrum, I'm always a little bit conscious here because there's a lot of negative connotations linked to temper tantrums. We hear adults talking about children having a temper tantrum. Oh, it's just a tantrum. They're trying to get they're trying to get their own way. I hear that a lot. Or adults that might have a temper tantrum, and people say, "Oh, look, they've thrown their toys out of the pram," and I can understand why, because a temper tantrum definitely has a manipulative aspect to it. The individual that's having a temper tantrum, as you'll see on the slide there, they are aware of what's going on around them. They're aware of other people's reactions, and ultimately they are trying to get their own way. But I do want you to remember that whilst a temper tantrum is, for the most part, an uncontrolled outburst of anger and frustration, those are the two kind of real driving emotions behind it, anger and frustration. That anger and frustration signifies a need, because all behaviour is a form of communication. So what I don't want us to do is to have very negative attitudes towards someone of any age having a temper tantrum, but particularly a child or young person, because even if their behaviour does seem completely unfair and unnecessary, it's been triggered by an emotional response. They're feeling something, they're frustrated about something. What you will note is that is usually more verbal than physical, but can continue into physical behaviour. And that normally somebody having a temper tantrum won't hurt themselves, because that's not their goal. They want to influence change. They do want to get their own way. They don't go into that temper tantrum intending to harm themselves or anybody else, really. So that's a temper tantrum. It's where the individual is in control and they're reacting to the intense anger and frustration within themselves and kind of letting it all loose because they want to get their own way and influence the situation that they're in that they're not happy about. In comparison, as I've said, a meltdown is where the autistic person experiences temporary loss of behavioural control. But for me, what's really, really important to emphasise to you is that a meltdown can be triggered by any emotion. So sometimes it will be triggered by anger or frustration, but it can be triggered by the full range of emotions. It could be triggered because somebody is intensely sad about something that's happened, or they're grieving about something. It might be because they are frustrated because they're trying to frustrated with themselves because they're trying to learn something new and they're finding it really challenging. It might be because they're really scared about a change that's happened. Maybe someone new is coming to look after them, or they're being taken along to a new club that they haven't participated in before and they're feeling really, really frightened. Or it can be a reaction to something which you might think is very positive. So maybe there's something that they're really looking forward to. It could be a birthday, or a special trip to a favourite place, maybe a swimming lesson that they have every 2 weeks, and they, that's the highlight of their fortnight. It's hard for a neurotypical person to understand sometimes why something positive that we've got to look forward to can turn into a trigger for a meltdown. But the thing about autistic people is that we do really struggle with change. The reason that we do have outwardly restrictive and repetitive behaviours is to try and exert some control and some safety and some feeling that we know what's happening to us, because we have naturally high levels of anxiety, and ambiguity, change, uncertainty makes us feel really vulnerable. So when we're building up to a really positive event that we're looking forward to, as we start to get towards that, the anticipation of waiting, counting down, my sons like to count sleeps, we count down the sleeps towards a birthday or a special event, but that process of working from a time perspective, the process of, we're visual thinkers, so we're thinking about what that event's going to be like, and we're trying to imagine and picture, and we're getting that in our head, and it's a very vivid image, and then we start to doubt, what if it's not like we thought it was going to be? And we start to get really worried because we don't want to be disappointed. So there's that whole piece as well. And actually, the intensity of a surprise, autistic people don't tend to like surprises. We like to know what's going to happen, that new thing or exciting thing or that special event, so we can prepare ourselves, we can do our research, we can ask our questions. And parents often love the idea of a surprise, don't they? I've seen my son show me videos on YouTube of like families surprising their child with a pet puppy or a kitten in a box, and the child bursts into tears, or surprising them with tickets to Disneyland and they're getting on the plane in just a few hours. For an autistic person, that's such an overwhelm, such a lack of control, that in itself can cause the most intensest meltdown of all. Now, when we are having a meltdown, it might mean that somebody that usually is verbal can't express themselves verbally. So some people may become mute, they literally can't talk. Or I certainly know the feeling that I have is that I can't express myself properly because my emotions are so wild, and I'm usually really crying and really upset, and my thoughts do become quite irrational, and therefore I can't string a cogent sentence together. It just doesn't work. Because we are in that situation where we're experiencing such an intense, overwhelming response, we aren't aware of the other people around us and the impact that we're having. So it may be that our behaviour is really upsetting for people that are observing it. It might be frightening if there are children or elderly people close by that haven't seen that behaviour before. But in that moment, we genuinely can't logically rationalize about our impact on others. Afterwards, through a period of reflection, then we can start to think about, oh God, that must have been really awful for that person to witness. But in the moment, we won't think like that. And it may result in self-injury, either because we're thrashing and crashing about and, throwing things out the way and may unintentionally hurt ourselves, or sometimes we may revert to self-harm because the intensity of that meltdown, the emotional pain and overwhelm that we're in, it feels like your head is going to explode. And the only way sometimes to break that cycle, you feel, is to cause yourself physical pain, and that physical pain can almost provide a welcome release and a distraction from the mental torment that you're in. So hopefully I've been able to give you an idea of what the difference is between a temper tantrum and a meltdown. What I would also say, we're going to look at a really nice analogy in a little bit about using a water tank that one of my colleagues put together, and how the overflowing water tank represents stress in an individual, and how that can build up and lead to a meltdown. But a couple of personal examples for you to think about. So when I experience a meltdown, to me, in the build up, I notice that I'm getting to a tipping point, and it's almost like before I can do anything logical about it, it moves really fast. So it's like a tidal wave. And 1 second I look and the ocean is flat, but I can maybe see something happening in the distance. And the next minute there's this wall of water that's going to literally overpower me and crush me and hurt the people that I care about around me. And it's really, really frightening, because in my head I'm thinking, where's the high ground? How can I escape? Where can I get to a safe place? But in that moment I can't get to the safe place. My friend, who's a photographer, an autistic photographer, he says for him it's like imagining that he's driving along in his car and everything's going fine, and then he gets to the top of this very steep hill and he looks over the breast of the hill and he might see some people crossing the road with their shopping or whatever it may be, a line of ducks crossing the road from the duck pond just over there, and he's got to pay attention to all of the hazards. And then suddenly he looks down and his steering wheel's gone and all of his controls are gone. There isn't a gear stick or a brake. There's nothing. And the car starts rolling, and as it's rolling it's picking up speed, and he can see the ducks and the children and the businessmen with their lunch crossing the road from the cafe, and they're all in front of him, and he knows he's going to crash into them and really hurt them. They can't do anything. He can't stop the car because the controls are gone. So whichever one of those analogies not appeals to you more, but feels more comfortable, try and bear that in mind the next time the autistic person that you support has a meltdown, because then hopefully you'll be able to imagine how frightening it is and how overwhelming it is, and how even if there is somewhere in there the desire to make it stop, you really don't know how. It's like, because it is like all of your tools and your resources have been taken away. In comparison, a shutdown can seem very mild and tame, and from a carer's perspective much more easy to deal with, because it's kind of uneventful. It can almost seem like no reaction at all, but actually shutdowns can have just as big an impact on the autistic person. So as I said, they can occur directly after a meltdown, or they might occur on their own. But what you will typically see in a shutdown is that the person will become non-verbal. They don't want to speak. They'll be very, very quiet. Or if they are talking to you, maybe you sense something's wrong and you ask them what's wrong, and they might seem confused. Their eyes are glazed. They become quite inarticulate. It's hard for them to communicate. They tend to want to be on their own, so they retreat to a safe space. They want to be still. They want to be quiet. They might climb under a blanket. Or they might be stimming. So those self-stimulating behaviours, whatever they do, if they play with hair or rub fingernails, or they rock or they hum, whatever their usual stim is, you might find that they're doing that much more intensely because they're trying to draw in on themselves and shut out everything on the outside. So the typical things that you will see in a shutdown is that we seem very, very tired. That kind of bone tiredness that you get from completing a very intense physical exertion like a marathon, or maybe you've been a long trek, or it reminds me a little bit of the feeling when you're in the early stages of pregnancy, when the growing baby is taking all of your resources and mum just feels like everything's dragging on the floor because you're just so utterly drained regardless of how much you sleep. Now that's the kind of fatigue that somebody in a shutdown will experience. They'll find it really difficult to concentrate on questions. They won't typically want to watch TV or read a book. They want to just be still and quiet, and unless it's their special interest, they will do nothing. So I guess from a parent carer perspective, it can be a bit unnerving and worrying that they're just wanting to sit and stare into space, or that they're sleeping much more than usual. Maybe they're taking lots of daytime naps, or they're doing a whole 14-hour stretch in bed, which they would never normally do. But think about sleep. It has a very important role to play in our health and well-being. And when we sleep at unusual times, or more than usual, it's because our body is saying it needs to recharge. And it's okay that we do want to withdraw and be on our own. From a sensory perspective, obviously, like neurotypical people, you get autistic extroverts and you get autistic introverts. But even for the extroverts who enjoy other people's company, in the event of a shutdown, you don't want to see or hear or smell or connect with anybody else. You want to go to a comfortable space, often your bedroom, and you might put on headphones and listen to music, or you might indulge so fully in your special interest that, you know, whatever it is that you do, if it's something creative with your hands or something that you like to read and research about, or it's a particular type of television program that you watch or music that you listen to, by hyper focusing, which is of course how our autistic brains are programmed, we like to do that very intense concentration, one thing at a time. That hyper focus in itself and indulging that special interest that means so much to us is very, very powerful, and it will contribute towards our recharge, and it will help us come out of the other side of a shutdown. So whilst as a parent carer you might think this is a bit scary and are they getting depressed and I'm worried about them, I don't want to leave them on their own, you have to kind of trust that as long as they are accepting food and drink that you take to them, they probably won't want to come and join family meals or anything, they won't be able to. But as long as they're accepting food and drink and they're not doing any self-harming behaviours, then you can trust that they're in control of that situation in terms of protecting themselves, and they'll come out of the other side feeling much, much better and somewhat healed. So we have to ask ourselves then, why do autistic people have meltdowns and shutdowns and neurotypical people don't? And there are two kind of significant features that we want you to understand. The first is our intense sensory experience of the world, which, whilst it can be very empowering and magical in some ways, it can also be intensely overwhelming and painful. And then you've also got our neurological differences, the fact that our brain is wired differently to yours, and the way that our brain communicates to other parts of the brain, those neural pathways are very, very different, and therefore affect how we react in intense situations. So what you can see here on this slide is a little bit of an explanation about some of those neurological differences. Now, autistic people have probably been around since the beginning of time. There is evidence going back as far as the Stone Age that autistic people were around. But bizarrely, it's only since the 1940s that our society and the world as a whole has recognised autism as a condition, as a result of research that was done at that time by male doctors and scientists, specifically Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner. And so really, autism is very, very new in terms of the way it's talked about and understood. And autistic cognition, why we think the way we do and why the way we react we do, they still don't really know. The doctors, the scientists, the researchers, they are working really hard to try and understand, and there have been lots of different theories over the years that have been put forward, but it's hard for them to be able to pinpoint, because there are over 100 genes alone that contribute to somebody being autistic, or over 100 genes that are linked to autism. So it's it's still somewhat of a mystery. But what we do know is that there are areas of the brain in autistic people that are hyperconnected. So maybe to try and imagine it like the information moves more quickly and is received in a more intense way. There are other areas of the brain, normally those areas that are logistically further apart, whereby the connections are slower or not as strong, and therefore it can take longer for us to process and react to some types of information. Now, the picture of the brain there, you've got the left and right sides, and what you'll see in the middle is kind of a pinky, to me it looks like a butterfly shape almost. That is actually a significant area of white matter in the brain called the corpus callosum. And what we see is that In autistic people, the corpus callosum tends to be hyperconnected. As a result, when we receive sensory input, our brain pays whole attention to it all of the time. So imagine the environment that you're in at the moment and all of the different sensory input that you might be impacted with. It could be smells or sounds from another room or from outside. It might be the feel of your clothing against your skin, a piece of food caught between your teeth, or the feeling of the hard chair that you're sitting on. All of that sensory input, for us, it's like buzzers and bells are going off, or little flags are popping up, and it's drawing our attention to it all of the time. Look at me, notice this, do this, what does that mean? So our sensory environment is very intrusive, and it means that if we want to actually be able to concentrate and learn or relax, we have to address the sensory environment first. And for some individuals, that means reducing the sensory input. So if noise is a very difficult trigger for us, then removing or reducing the noise is a helpful thing to do if you want the autistic person to be calm and relaxed. But there are other types of sensory processing where we are undersensitive. So often in autistic people, our proprioception, our ability for our body and our limbs to know where they are in relation to everything else in the room, and the physical contact that we need from people in the space around us, that can be really lacking. So we kind of seek that type of input. My son, that used to be restrained and excluded at school, he's a sensory seeker in that respect. He has low proprioception, so he wants lots of intense physical input. He can't sit still. He's climbing and jumping and touching and tasting. He likes to be rough housed with dad. He wants to jump, touching the sky on the trampoline, or run into freezing cold sea in just his underpants. He's seeking those intense sensory experiences. For him to be able to concentrate and learn, he needs that intense input before he can be calm and relax. Now, in comparison, neurotypical people, you still receive all of that input, but your brains are really much more effective at dealing with it, because your brain either gets habituated to that background stuff that isn't really meaningful at the time, or your brain says, do you know what? Yeah, I can hear next door's mowing their lawn, or I can smell the bread in the bread machine in the kitchen, but I don't need to do anything about that now. So it's not important, get rid of it. And it's much easier for a neurotypical person then to almost like cut through the sensory environment and focus on the task at hand and what's needed of them. So now, if you're watching this webinar, I imagine that your concentration is very much focused on the sound of my voice and what you're seeing on the screen with the slides and with me. For autistic people, being able to achieve that concentration is much harder because our sensory input is so intrusive. It's pervasively, actively processed. We notice everything. We can't help it. And we notice the lack of it if we need it. And that in itself can contribute to a meltdown experience. The other thing from a neurological differences perspective is that in the front of our brains, everybody's brains, neurotypical and neurodiverse, you have here your frontal lobes, and within those frontal lobes are some critical cognitive functions or skills known as your executive functions. And those executive functions are a critical part of you being able to perform and be independent right the way through your life. Your executive function first probably comes into play when you start at infant school, and you know that you're taught when you get there to put your lunchbox on that shelf and your coat on the peg and your diary in the box by the door, and it's knowing how to manage yourself and comply and meet rules. And obviously, as you go up through high school and further in higher education or into the world of work, the significance of those executive function skills becomes much, much more important. But to give you a summary, it includes things like your planning, your organising, your time management. It includes your working memory, so being able to remember steps in a process or how something works on a day-to-day basis. It significantly impacts your problem-solving skills. your self-regulation. So that's in terms of monitoring your own behavior and its appropriateness in relation to the situation that you're in, but also your emotional regulation. Now, for autistic people, this is a massive area because we find emotional regulation really tricky. Our emotions are often dialed up to a 10, whereas a neurotypical person's natural place or level of emotion might be at a 5. So our inability to regulate that intensity of emotion will mean that our reactions can seem over the top, unnecessary, excessive, and we get judged for that. That she's very, I cry at the slightest thing. Normally, anything sad things, or sometimes happy things, but my children in particular think it's really, really funny that, oh, mum's crying again, because it takes the slightest little thing to really move me. But I don't have any control of that. My body feels something and it has that intense reaction. So bearing in mind that in your frontal lobes, those executive functions are responsible for all of that critical stuff, which enables you to plan your day-to-day life, to multitask, to appear amenable to other people because you can control your actions and your emotions. In autistic people, that is impaired. It's thought, again, that they don't have science doesn't have all of the answers, and we don't have a register of autistic people and their experiences anywhere, but we think that around 80% of autistic people have impaired executive functioning. And for me, and I'm somebody that, because I was late diagnosed, not diagnosed till 42, I've held down a number of really significant responsible jobs as a human resources manager and director. I'm married, I have 2 children, I own my own house. For me, the most disabling part of my autism, I now realise, is my poor executive function. First of all, because of the extreme stress that it causes me to try and meet everybody's expectations, to be on time, to be able to prioritise, to control my emotions. That's such a huge ask on me. And it's also because of the judgment that you get if you don't meet those standards that say this is what you should do and when, and how you should behave according to neurotypical expectation. You're seen as a bit of a failure if you can't get somewhere on time, or if you have a very emotional reaction to a situation where a neurotypical person might still feel the same level of intensity but can put a lid on it and not embarrass themselves by being very emotional and outspoken in their reaction. So this is why, again, because of our impaired executive functioning, it's why meltdowns are much more likely to happen to us, because of that feeling of vulnerability, of failure, of lack of control, of being judged because we don't have strength in these executive functioning areas. Now, they are learnable skills. I've been trying to learn my whole life, and I can do some of this stuff pretty well now, but none of it is natural. None of it comes easy. It's all about trying to work out, understand the rules and the processes, like, using to-do lists and reminders and diarising and visual prompts to try and have a bit more control over my day-to-day life. But it's really, really tricky. So you can see a summary there of the meltdowns and shutdowns triggers, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail into some of them, but just briefly, that change of routine or unexpected change that I mentioned, because of the way that it creates ambiguity and uncertainty for us, can feel very threatening and can lead to a meltdown. Sensory overload, or actually I would call that sensory processing differences, because if I'm oversensitive to types of sensory input, like I'm very sensitive to heat, if I get too hot and I've got no way of cooling down, I start to feel almost like panicky and trapped and closed in. But for somebody who is undersensitive to certain types of sensory input, the lack of that type of sensory input and the fact that their body is craving it, if they don't get that, can lead to a meltdown. Physical contact, can cause a meltdown. Information overload can cause a meltdown. Confrontation can cause a meltdown, and also tiredness and exhaustion. So let's look at some of these in a bit more detail. Now, because of our impaired executive functioning, it's perhaps easier for you now to understand why we work best when we've got our familiar routines, our comfortable experiences, our known people, because it gives us some parameters, some boundaries in which to manage our day-to-day lives that feel comfortable and safe and that don't put unnecessary stress on us. If you try and change or have to change a routine or experience or a familiar person, then that can feel like a real threat to the autistic person. We take a long time to build trust with another person. So if a child at school suddenly has a new teacher or a TA, it can take a long time for them to build up the bond and the trust, much slower than maybe their neurotypical peers, because they're just waiting to be let down. They don't know whether that person's going to be consistent. You know, they seem nice on day 1 and day 2, but let's say that they tell that person off for having the wrong shoes on day 3. That's going to stay in their kind of memory bank now, is that's how that teacher behaves. That teacher is someone to potentially be feared, or who's a bit of a meanie, and it's very, very difficult to establish a productive relationship until there's been lots of experiences over time that allow the autistic person to judge overall what that person is really like. Other things that could affect the autistic young people that you know might be having to change the route to school because they're doing roadworks or the road is closed for some reason. It's just a practical issue to most people. To an autistic person can feel really wrong, like doesn't make sense. That's the way that I feel comfortable going, and they don't want to do that new route. And even if you do it several times over the course of the next 2 weeks, in their head they're still pining for that familiar route because they knew how long it took and what happens and who they might bump into on the way. And also, if you change something that they're looking forward to, so obviously with COVID, lots of after school clubs and stuff like that got cancelled. For an autistic person who might find it challenging to socialise outside of school, those clubs become a bit of a lifeline because they're familiar faces doing an activity that they really enjoy, and that extended absence and gap is really, really tricky for them. So any of those changes are going to contribute towards our anxiety, whereas routine and things staying static and as they are will reduce our anxiety. Hopefully this will help you see that when that change happens, which can't always be prevented, the individual will feel like they're not in control, and it could lead to a meltdown very quickly. Now, I'd just like you to pause for a second, because I'm going to walk you through a little mindfulness exercise to help you get closer to the autistic sensory experience and what it feels like for the sensory environment to be intrusive and ever present. So wherever you're sitting at the moment as you're watching the webinar, I'd just like you to pause and take a look around you and really notice what's around you and what you can see and what you can hear. So tear your eyes away from the screen. What else is happening in that room around you? Look at the walls and what's hanging up on the walls. Is anything hanging wonky or crooked? Look at the floor. Does it need a hoover? Can you see animal hair or bits of fluff that are annoying you, and now you feel like you really want to go and pick it up because you like to keep the house tidy? Do you notice any areas of clutter? Maybe piles of old newspapers or homework that your son or daughter left out last night and their pencil case has fallen open on the floor? Do you look around and you suddenly notice, oh, there's the remote control that you thought you'd lost. It's under the cat tree. So just really pull it all in. Notice, look up, look for the corners. Are there cobwebs that you would have never even noticed when you come in this room every day? And then think about the sounds. So it's raining outside where I am. So maybe you suddenly can tune into the sound of the rain. Or is someone walking around upstairs? Or can you hear furniture scraping in the room next door? Or maybe you can hear birdsong. Then I'd like you to pay attention to your breathing. Can you sense your heartbeat? If you can't, try and tune into it. Place your hand on your chest and just really listen and feel. And how fast is it beating? Is it beating regularly? Can you detect any smells? It might be smell of shampoo on your hair that you washed this morning, or fabric conditioner on your clothes. Or it might be you can still smell the smoky bacon that you had for breakfast. Which brings us on to taste. Are there any lingering tastes in your mouth that might be pleasant, like the coffee that you've just drunk? Mine's cold. But it might be that you burnt the toast this morning and you didn't have time to brush your teeth again afterwards. And now you've got this horrible burny toast taste in your mouth that you didn't realise how horrible it was until you really paid attention to it. And then I want you to just think about, do those senses remind you of anything? Because our memories and our emotions and our senses are all very closely linked in the brain. And sometimes all it can take is a specific colour or a smell, or I always think of that feeling, when you first get off a plane in a hot country, which hasn't happened to me for a very long time. But that feeling as they open the plane doors and you walk out and you almost get like a waft of warm holiday air breeze on you. And it's like, you're on holiday. And sometimes you might not be on holiday, but you can, I don't know, be in a cold, like the way stores seem to try and air condition themselves to the point of refrigeration. And then you walk out into a hot street and suddenly you get that same sensation and it puts a smile on your face. Now, the reason I'm asking you to try and tune into this stuff is to really sort of pull your attention to the fact that we are all bombarded by sensory input constantly. And neurotypical people do get really good at tuning it out, and autistic people find it much harder. That's why your young person may find clothes really, really tricky. They might really hate anything with, they want to cut out all the labels. They want all textures to be soft, no seams. They don't like elastic cuffs or high neck jumpers. Or anything tight around the waist. That they very much want clothes to feel like they've almost not got clothes on, because otherwise it becomes a distraction. I've been married for countless years. I think 11 years. I've been with my husband nearly 18 years. But I don't wear my wedding rings at the moment, simply because I have put on a little bit of weight, and honestly, when I wear them when I put them on, my hands feel so claustrophobic, and because they're tricky to get off again, all I can feel is that sort of like intense panicky feeling about what if I can't get them off. I don't really wear any jewellery, to be honest, other than earrings, because I can feel it on and it starts to become a distraction and annoying, even though I love the look of jewellery. So sensory overload is very, very easy for an autistic person to feel. And all of that stuff, when you're meant to be concentrating, when you're meant to be doing your homework, or you're in a class of 30 other kids all sniffing, coughing, scraping their chairs, secretly crunching a bag of crisps, the horrible smell of canteen food down the hall, all of that sensory stuff can mean that in a school environment, the autistic person really struggles to learn, even if they're intellectually very capable. Now, in terms of physical contact, it's a bit of a myth that autistic people don't like physical contact. I grew up thinking that. Bizarrely, even though I wasn't diagnosed as a child, my mum worked in a school with a mainstream school with a special education unit, and she would talk about autistic children that would not want to be touched, and she'd say how sad it was that they didn't want to be hugged and stuff. Now, some autistic people don't like touch, and some autistic people really crave it. They're undersensitive to it, and so they like nothing more than like deep pressure massage on the shoulders to help them feel calm, or really tight squeezy bear hugs. I am in the middle on this one because I'm very tactile and affectionate with my children and my husband, and I love being tickled, like stroked. But if a strange person touches me, I don't mean strangers in weird, I mean like a stranger, or even if they're not a stranger, if they're just a friend or an extended family member, I don't want to be touched by them. And so if they do touch me, it does feel very intrusive and makes me feel very uncomfortable. I really struggled when I was pregnant with Leo and Henry, that strangers would come up and just touch my bump. And it would make me want to scream, but I kind of learned that they're just being kind, and that, you know, people love to see new life being grown, and they kind of can't help themselves. But still, if you're very sensitive to that type of touch, then it can feel really, really intrusive and actually make you quite angry. There are also specific types of physical interaction that autistic people will commonly feel or find really tricky. So things like haircuts, nail clipping, any of those kind of personal grooming things can feel physically painful or really intrusive, again, for an autistic person. And therefore it can become a bit of a battle and an argument, and you end up letting their nails grow until they're so long you can see the dirt under them, or maybe they've got hair like a wild caveman because they won't let anyone with a pair of scissors get near them. But equally, if you've got somebody who really needs lots of touch, lots of physical input, they're very tactile, and they don't have that, maybe there's someone that lives alone and they desperately, you know, they never get hugged from anybody. Or I've been doing some work with adults with learning disabilities and autism, and one of the service users, for no fault of his own, ended up in a mental health hospital. And he had very high proprioceptive need. He was used to his family and his care team providing lots of physical touch. He had a trampoline sunk into the ground out in his garden where he could bounce to his heart's content. He liked to like rest his forehead against yours and look into your eyes. That was his way of like connecting and feeling really close to you. And obviously in the context of a mental health hospital, without that flexibility and resources, and especially because of COVID and not being able to have face-to-face visitors, the lack of proprioceptive input significantly contributed to a decline in his mental health, which is why, therefore, you can see in this example, meltdowns happening for both reasons, either because somebody who doesn't like to be touched or touched in a particular place has been touched, or because somebody's craving that physical connection with another human but isn't allowed it or isn't able to access it. And then it just becomes really, really uncomfortable for them. With the information overload, autistic people are very individual. I'm the type of person that asks 1,000,001 questions and wants all the context and the backstory before I feel like I can understand something. But I used to have a colleague, an autistic colleague, who was very much, what's the bare bones? Give me the bullet points that, you know, what I have to do and when by, and that was enough. So when it comes to information, I think you need to look at and get to know and ask what the individual likes to receive. Even for someone like me that wants all the detail, where information overload affects me is when multitasking. So if I've got lots of different conflicting priorities, it's really, really hard for me to create some kind of like sense and rank a list of how to do things and when by, and I end up burying my head in the sand and doing nothing. Things that will make it worse is if you try and pressure an autistic person to try and make a quick decision, because we do have a slower processing speed, and that's not an intellectual deficit. It's just that when we receive auditory input, we take our time to really process and make sense and reflect and question and wonder what that means to us and what are we being asked. And we like to weigh up the pros and cons before making a decision. And you may find with the children and young people that you know who are autistic, that when you try and rush them to make a decision, or you get impatient because you want an answer, you can sometimes create a meltdown out of nothing for them. You're the trigger, because you're not allowing them the time to think and digest. Similarly, if instructions or information is unclear, or if you change the goalposts, because yesterday you said this was the place to put your coat, and then the next day you say, actually, it makes sense to put it over there, that in itself can make us really kind of frustrated and cross, because it's like, well, which is right, and why have you made that change? Autistic people can be very blunt and direct in communication. So when I was growing up and in the world of work, I would often be told that I was too outspoken, that I was too direct, too honest. In the workplace, it kind of went both ways, because I would either have people saying that they loved my integrity and the fact that I said what I thought, and that made them really respect me, or I'd have people saying that there was no like chit chat or a personal chat. They didn't like the fact that I would just go in and ask the question or ask what I needed from them because they're contributing towards my project, and they'd find my bluntness quite disarming and uncomfortable, and frankly some people found it rude. Now, that is the way we communicate. We tend to say what we think and say what we see. My husband has said to me so many times, like, can you just think before you speak? And I said to him, it's like getting a bottle of fizzy drink and shaking it up with the lid on, and then taking the lid off and asking it not to overflow. Or it's like getting a grenade, pulling the pin and then going, don't explode, please, because we can't help it. Our thoughts pour out faster than we can reflect and regulate on them. We don't mean to be rude. And the danger is that people that don't know us can see that kind of very blunt, direct communication as a confrontation. And I've got myself in situations before where, like, say I've been parking in a car park and someone's stolen my space, and I've mouthed through the window a rude word, and then when I've got out my car, that person's waiting to have a go at me, and I'm terrified, because the last thing I want is a confrontation. We don't like confrontation. We don't like arguments. It's very intimidating and upsetting, and we could quite possibly burst into tears. I know I would, because of that intense emotional reaction. The other thing about confrontation is that because people don't understand the way our brains work, we get judged on neurotypical standards. So my little boy was getting, he's nearly 10 now, say little, he's getting ginormous, but he's been bullied at school recently. And he'll come home and tell me what's happening, but he doesn't feel comfortable raising it in school. And so I then have to go to the teacher and say, look, this has happened, you know, can you investigate it, da, da, da. And the teachers are judging him by very neurotypical standards, because his class teacher, who has a good relationship with my son, but he says, you know, he should be able to talk to me if there's a problem, and he should be able to share his feelings. Now, those expectations are what neurotypical people believe children should be able to do. Children should be able to raise if there's a problem. Children should be able to go to an adult. Children should be able to say what they're feeling. But those standards shouldn't be the same for autistic children, because we're not wired, autistic people, we're not wired that way. It's much more difficult for us to raise a a tricky situation or complain about something. And if we do, what tends to happen is we're often met with a defensive response, or we're bombarded with questions. And then we almost like backpedal and try and retreat and downplay the situation because we don't like the interrogation. And then we get criticized so much for being awkward, different, fussy, rude, and sensitive. And it completely crushes our self-esteem. You do, and obviously I grew up undiagnosed, but I felt different from everybody when I was growing up, and I was really worried. I felt like I was less than human, like I was pretending to be a human, and I thought that I was criticized so much. I felt like I was a horrible person, that I wasn't a nice person, that I didn't deserve nice things to happen to me. So that confrontation can really, over time, crush our self-esteem. And you know, I've had parents say to me on courses, I feel like I'm constantly telling them off, I'm constantly having a go at them. If you find yourself in that situation, stop, pause, reflect, take a back step. What can you do differently, holistically, to change that situation? Because the continuous confrontation, even if there are things about the young person's behavior that is proving really tricky for you, all the confrontation is going to do is exacerbate conflict and drive a meltdown. So I mentioned tiredness and exhaustion, didn't I, and how that contributes to a shutdown, but that can contribute to a meltdown as well. And there will be different reasons why we feel extra tired and overwhelmed to the point of meltdown. So intense sensory input or sensory overload can cause that feeling of just complete drained, feel so drained. Information overload, trying to multitask, can make you feel like that. Masking, so that pressure that we place upon ourselves to appear like other people, the way we copy and mask and mirror, camouflage, so that we appear to integrate with our peers, that is very exhausting. Then there's that whole piece about how we marry up expectations in our head with our visual brains with the reality of situations, and that feeling of disappointment, which can make us feel really, really exhausted. And then in terms of sleep, autistic people do experience lots of sleep problems. Either find it very difficult to shut their brain off and wind down at night, or might wake up through the night or wake up very early. All of these things combined lead to a much higher than average level of tiredness and exhaustion. So that's just a quick reminder of the triggers there. And now I'm going to walk you through the overflowing tank. So this is a really good analogy for the cause and experience of a meltdown and why the tank overflows. So this first picture of a tank I'm going to show you is a neurotypical tank. You'll see at the bottom there's a small amount of water to represent the level of stress felt by an individual. And then on the top left, you've got a tap, fairly narrow tap, and that is your water or stress input. Down the bottom on the right, you've got another tap, a tap you'll notice that's much wider. And that tap helps you manage the stress and to use relaxation to reduce and drain off some of that stress the individual's feeling. But this specific tank is typically how a neurotypical person experiences stress. Now, we're not trying to downplay the level of stress that a neurotypical person may feel at all. We absolutely recognise that everybody has stresses in their lives. Some people have very, very stressful lives. But what we're trying to demonstrate is that each day, as you get stuff happening, which can raise your stress levels, whether you're really, really late, you get delayed on the way to work, the car breaks down, or your train gets cancelled, the really important meeting you've been waiting for weeks, can't go ahead, or the gym that you were looking forward to going to after work has had a flood and now you can't. All of that kind of stuff building up means that over the course of a typical day, your stress levels are going to start to increase. However, because you have that wider tap, because the neurotypical brain is quite good at knowing what helps me calm down, what helps me feel better because of all this stress, and what helps is really variable depending on the individual. So it might be a beer at the pub with a colleague before I get on the train home. It might be going home and hiding under a duvet watching your favourite television programme and eating a big thing of Haagen-Dazs. It might be going to the gym, or it might be going home and sitting in the garden and doing some yoga, or walking your dog. You know, there's so many different ways that we relax, unwind, distress, and we all have different things we like to do that make us happy. But the fact is that most neurotypical people, they know what that stuff is, and they know that to stay mentally well, they have to fit that in their day-to-day lives. So by prioritizing, using their executive functioning skills and mapping out how their week works and where they can fit in opportunities to do the stuff they love, they enable the stress to start to drain out, so that even though over the course of the day your stress goes up, at the end of the day or the week, you've put in enough of that you time of doing stuff that you like. It might be on your own, it might be with other members of your family or friends, but you've had enough time to do stuff that actually makes you feel good and that can reduce and release some of that stress out of the bottom of the tank. Now, on this next slide, you'll see the autistic tank, and what you may notice right away is that the water at the bottom is already deeper. So our natural kind of regular level of stress is already higher than a neurotypical person's, because the world around us represents so much ambiguity and uncertainty, which makes us feel very vulnerable. You'll notice also that the pipe that lets in the stress or the water is much wider, because we're much more sensitive to the external environment, both from a sensory needs perspective and because of our lack of ability to use executive functioning skills to manage our lives in a cohesive way. You'll also notice that the tap at the bottom of our tank, which lets out the stress and allows us to do stuff to relax and chill out and overcome stressful feelings, is really narrow. In comparison to the tap, the big wide tap where the stress is going in. What happens is, on a day-to-day basis, stuff happens all around us. It might be to do with sensory input. It might be to do with a break in our routine. It might be that we're trying to do a specific task at school or at work, but there's constant interruptions. And that stress starts to pour into our tanks at a much faster rate. Because we're not good at planning and prioritising and multitasking and managing our emotions, we're not that good. Even if we know the stuff that makes us feel good and we have our special interests that we love with an intense passion, it's really tricky for us to be able to make time for ourselves when we're still juggling all of that day to day, whether you're talking about a young person at school or at college or somebody that started in the world of work. The conflicting demands that are placed upon a person, just in terms of like managing your own personal hygiene and self-care routine, managing the transition between home and school or home and work, managing the expectations of what you have to physically do and learn or deliver on a given day. And then, of course, as you get older, being able to run a home and look after your finances and all that kind of thing. It's all so much that for the autistic person, it's much harder for us to be able to kind of press pause and actually make some time to do the stuff that's going to help us feel better. As a result, our stress levels rise really quickly and they remain high. So we you'll see there, that because the stress is coming in so fast, but the output tap is so narrow, it just keeps going up and up and up. And eventually there'll be one thing that happens, and it might seem like a minor thing. Often the actual trigger for the meltdown can be the straw that broke the camel's back. It might be that over the course of the week at school, your young person, they forgot their PE kit on Monday and they got a whatever the sanction is at the school, could have been a detention or a note in the contact book to the parent. And then on Tuesday, they saved a seat for their friend in the canteen, and someone else came and kicked their bag off of it and sat there instead. And then on Wednesday, they were really looking forward to their favourite subject, which is English, and the teacher was off, and it was a cover teacher, and she was really bad, and she didn't even, you know, they were expected to pick up on Romeo and Juliet that they'd been studying, but she didn't. She started another text, and suddenly it gets to Thursday, and the student is just feeling so fed up with school, and then they get home, and on Thursday, you always have macaroni cheese for dinner, and you said, oh, I'm really sorry, I haven't got macaroni. I was just going to do like a penne with tomato sauce. And they just explode. And the parent thinks, God, they're being so unreasonable. Like, where is all this coming from? The crying and smashing around and lashing out over pasta. But it's not about pasta. It's about everything else that happened in that week that felt like an injustice, that felt unfair, that felt uncertain and vague and frightening. And then the straw that breaks the camel's back, that one little thing that happens, and you get the overflow. The water pours out of the tank and you see the ugly. You see the shouting, the screaming, the crying, the hitting, the spitting, the destroying. And it's really, really tough for you to witness and for them to go through. Now, this is really important, right? Because you might think that if someone's had a meltdown, that's dealt with all the stuff, the problem that was in their head. They've got it all out, so everything should be fine now. But all the meltdown has done is show you that they've reached the tipping point, they've reached the overflow, they've reached the overwhelm level, and it's all too much, and blah, it's all come out. But the stress and the water is still up to the brim in the tank because it's not gone anywhere. You've only got that narrow outlet pipe at the bottom. And if the individual isn't good or doesn't know how to plan and prioritise and build stuff into their day, or it might feel impossible because if they're already late with school assignments all the time, and they're finding it really difficult to sleep, and they feel like their parents are always nagging them about jobs they haven't done around the house, and then you're talking to them about time for them and what makes them feel good, they'll look at you like they're bonkers because they're just like, well, when am I meant to fit that in? So this overflowing tank is still there, it's still waiting to overflow. And what that means is in any given week you could see the tank overflow again and again and again, because if you don't find a way to help them release the stress, build stuff into their life to manage their own expectations and their own well-being and stress levels, then they're going to be in this constant state of tension. And over time, that has physical health implications as well. So this is a little personal example. But do you remember that I mentioned earlier about how we can struggle when we've got something to look forward to, something like a special event or a family event that really matters to us? How sometimes that can be the cause of significant meltdowns, and neurotypical family members don't understand why. Now, my thing is often Christmas. And don't get me wrong, I love Christmas. I love everything Christmas. I love the decorations. I love the food. I love the Christmas carols. I love the roasted chestnuts. I love the elf on the shelf. Like, I like a real tree. I love buying presents. I like wrapping them so they look beautiful. Everything about Christmas to me is magical. And I want to recreate that for my children. Unfortunately, my husband is quite bar humbug about Christmas. He goes along with it for my sake, I suppose, and the boys' sakes. But he doesn't, I mean, he works really hard and contributes money, but he's not into the whole like prep, and for him it's all a bit over the top. So it's all on me. I have this vision in my head. Remember, I think in pictures, and I have this vision of the perfect Christmas and all of the things that have to happen and be in place at the right time for the right people, so that the boys' Christmas is this magical thing that I see in my head. And actually, all of that balancing and juggling, the disruption to my regular routines, particularly if we're hosting and we have people coming over, invading my safe space, and having to share my home, and people maybe not following my rules and my routines that suit me and make me feel comfortable in my own home, it's pretty much inevitable then that I will have at least one tearful meltdown, because I feel like I'm failing, that I'm not creating that Christmas magic that I wanted to create, because I'm putting too much expectation on myself. And after that, of course, I do tend to shut down and just want to be on my own for a day and not talk to anyone, see anyone, just be in silence, indulge in my special interests, and try and recover from my own kind of self-inflicted stress that I've put upon myself. The way that you might relate to it is like a storm. So you're out in the garden and hanging out the washing, and you look up and you see a few grey clouds in the distance, and you're like, oh, it didn't forecast that. That's strange. I hope those clouds aren't coming this way. And then all of a sudden the breeze starts to pick up and the washing's flapping on the line a bit more vigorously. And you're like, oh, well, at least the washing's going to get dry. But then, as you say, that torrential rain and suddenly thunder, lightning, and it's crazy. You run inside, the dog's barking because he wants to get out. A fence panel comes down, some of the washing flies off the line, the children's playhouse gets turned over on its side because of the strength of the wind. Mayhem, maybe some of your plants get ruined, and then it's over. And there's that quietness and calm. And there's the clear up operation when you have to go out into the garden and fix the fence panel and put upright everything that fell over, sort out the plants, pick up all the dead leaves, retrieve your washing that's blown over into your neighbour's garden. That clean up operation is something that you were going to have to engage in with the meltdown. The thing about the aftermath from a meltdown is that often the person who's observed and tried to support the person having the meltdown, so usually the parent or carer, can have really mixed emotions, because they might feel really sad that it's happened and sorry for the young person or the child, but they can also feel exhausted, angry, fed up. They might say to themselves, they don't mean it, but they'll say, I've had enough, like I can't cope with this anymore. What you've got to remember is that the autistic person will be feeling just as bad, if not worse, particularly as they get older, because when you come out the other side of a meltdown and you realise that you've let people down, that you've said unkind things, rejected people that are there to help you, you might have hurt someone that you like, physically hurt someone that you love, or you might be really ashamed because you've hurt yourself. And in our heads, there's almost like this paranoia of, oh God, I'm not going to be invited to family events anymore, or I'm so embarrassed, like then that the neighbours are going to hate me now because they've seen me behave like that at a barbecue that you went to. There's a real fear and anxiety around what other people think of us now, and whether or not we're liked anymore, whether we'll be given a chance to still have a relationship. And that's really, really frightening. You do also have to think about your feelings as the person supporting, because you can't stop the meltdowns and shutdowns from occurring. And of course, we are going to look at strategies for how to support the young person. But there's no way of escaping that. It is a physical and emotional drain on you as an individual, and it affects your stress tank, your water tank, if you're having to deal with this type of behavior on a regular basis. So some of the things that we feel after our after we've witnessed an autistic person's meltdown, you might feel hurt, scared, angry, really tired and exhausted. You might feel frustrated that it's your failure, that you're a bad parent. You might feel really depressed. And I think it's important for your own well-being that you share that with someone else. And it might be, if you're in a two-parent family, your partner. Or it might be that you've got really supportive grandparents, so your parents, that are helping you work through some of that difficult stuff, just to be able to share. Or there are really good online groups. So in Sussex, where I live, we have a local online group called Reaching Families, and that is a group that provides support and training courses and just people to talk to for any families with children with additional needs, not just autism. But I've personally found those groups really, really helpful in times when I have felt overwhelmed by my children's behaviour, when I've found my autistic children are draining all of my resources and I feel like I'm failing. Then being able to talk to other parents, or to a trusted audience who's not going to judge you and say that you're a rubbish mum for admitting that yesterday you didn't like your child, that's really, really important. You have to think about your own stress tank, and think about what you do to feel good in your life. And I've had parents and carers say to me before on courses, I don't get any time to myself. What am I meant to do? Are you going to come and look after the children for me? And I don't for one second want to minimize how difficult it is for people to make time for themselves. But I think it's about being realistic about what are those little things that you can do directly after a meltdown, whether that's go and sit in the garden on your own with a cup of herbal tea, or go and dance to Diana Ross in your kitchen because that's who you love listening to, or go and have a cuddle with the cat because they give unconditional love. It's those little things in the moment, and then it's about what stuff can you do on an evening or a weekend, whether that is some type of physical exercise or pursuing your hobbies, treating yourself to a new book that you really love. Time, for me, I know I go to bed too late. I go to bed after Nick and the boys, my husband and the boys, because it's the only time I do get to be alone most of the time. And it is a trade-off because I do need more sleep, but I love that quiet time when I've got the house to myself, well, just me and the cats, and I'll just stay up for an hour, and I might do some my hobby is photography, my special interest, so I might do some photo editing on my phone, or sometimes I don't normally watch television, but I might read a magazine or a book, or just make myself a cup of tea and a slice of toast and go, and enjoy the silence. But it's just about really looking at your day and whether you need to stretch your day at either end. I started getting up earlier as well, and I am not a morning person. Like, my husband's a real morning person, and I've always found it bizarre how chipper and how early he gets up. But I've actually realized that if I get up earlier in the morning, just half an hour, then if we're lucky, me and him can have half an hour together to sit in the garden with the cats and have a cup of coffee and have a chat before the boys wake up. And that's quite a treat, rather than like waking up and realizing I'm late for school, running downstairs, come on boys, dragging them out of bed, everyone's stressed. It's actually really nice to, create a positive window of time for myself by challenging my, having a growth mindset. And I do hate getting up in the morning, but if I do get up half an hour earlier, I have that half an hour time to do stuff for me and with my husband, and that works really well. In terms of how you can prepare for meltdowns and shutdowns, they are going to occur at some point. Some of your young people will be better at regulating their emotions than others. Some of them may be in much more supportive, flexible schools that are better at adapting to their needs. It's very individual. But what you can do is start to recognise how to prepare yourself for them happening and what you can do afterwards. And the key is always communication. So the first thing to do is, obviously this is not during a meltdown, but after a meltdown, when the young person is calm and in a good space, and ideally in a side-to-side activity. So maybe when you're driving along in the car together, or you're at the kitchen worktop preparing dinner together, or you're out walking the dog together, those side-by-side activities are really good times to have conversations. As soon as you sit them down at the kitchen table or on the sofa for a chat and you say, can I talk to you? And suddenly there's like, almost feels a bit like an interview, and autistic people do find it tricky to talk about their feelings a lot of the time. But if you're in that side-to-side activity that you're both engaged in and enjoying, it's much more easy to have a conversation, and you don't have to make eye contact, and it can feel much more relaxed. Just the physical movement creates some regulation in the body. But you can ask them to think about, what do they think triggered their meltdown, or generally what makes them get really, really stressed and upset, or why were they so worried about a particular situation, and ask them what you can do to help them in that situation. And if they haven't got any suggestions, you throw in a few suggestions. What do you think would help them? See what they think, sound it out. When someone's in a shutdown, they don't tend to want to talk to you, but you do need some way of communicating, particularly if, bringing up food to them, or maybe you have to pop out, or you've got to go next door for something and you want them to know where you are, but you don't want to knock on the door and annoy them. So you need to come up with a way of communicating. With my son that's nearly 10, if he's had a meltdown, I'll know it's kind of safe to approach him because he'll normally send me a text. And that works fine for me. It's like I know he's good at saying when he needs personal space, and I've learned to be good at giving him that and not kind of forcing my hugs and commiserations on him too soon. But you need to find out what works for your autistic young person, and you also need to think about what's the bare minimum that you need to do to keep them safe, because if they're laying face down in a really squishy pillow, that's potentially risky behaviour, so we do have to deal with that. Or if they've been in their room for the last 16 hours and the drink and the food that you place outside the room is still there, you need to be able to have a conversation because you're worried. They need to drink, they need to eat, they need to keep their energy up. The best thing that you can do for your autistic relatives and friends is let them know that they're loved and cared for, and that you don't consider the meltdown or the shutdown to be their failure, and that you're not angry with them. Now, of course, sometimes you will be angry with them. Sometimes you will be really fed up. Sometimes you'll be frustrated, you'll be sad, or you'll feel bad about yourself because you feel like, as I said, you're not being a good enough parent. But the best thing you can do for your autistic child is give them acceptance, and try, like you're doing now by watching this webinar or by coming on courses. You are trying to get into the autistic brain. You're trying to understand our mindset, why we behave the way we do, how we think, how we feel. And ultimately, we're very, very sensitive to rejection, and we just want to feel like people accept us and will give us a chance. And we genuinely can't control the meltdowns, but we can be helped to learn to reduce or remove triggers, certain triggers, and also to manage the aftermath, to be able to apologise and make amends with people that we might have hurt. Now, in terms of reducing the risks, from a sensory perspective, it's all about either reducing or removing the sensory input if they're hypersensitive, or providing the sensory input if they're undersensitive. Okay, so typical things that we see with light sensitivity, it's very easy adjusting curtains, putting dimmers on lights, providing sunglasses, removing background noise. I grew up in a home where literally, like, there was a TV in the kitchen, a TV in the lounge, and they'd both be on blaring the whole time, and my mum would be playing the radio in the kitchen. I hate competing noises, and my youngest son, who's only he's 6, is the same. So it's, you know, it's quite easy to adjust that, and we have provided actually our 6-year-old with noise cancelling headphones, because initially he was cross because he wanted them to be completely silent, and obviously that doesn't work. But now he gets, I think it's part of the proprioception, the pressure that he's getting from wearing them, physical pressure that he finds comforting, but also the fact that it does have a muffling effect and reduces the background noise for him is really comfortable. But there are lots of additional things you can see there on the slide in terms of providing a weighted lap cushion or a weighted blanket to give comforting proprioceptive input. If someone's a real fidgeter and can't stay at the table, a wobble cushion on the chair can really help them. And if they hate particular smells, like dad's aftershave really makes them angry, or someone in the smoke family, extended family, is a smoker, and whenever they come round, the child gets really stressed, then we do need to have to have that kind of slightly awkward conversation about, would you mind not smoking before you come over, because blah really does want to enjoy a cuddle with you, but they hate the smell of smoke. In terms of communication, and this is assuming that the child is verbal, but if they're not, making good use of the resources that you have. So if you use PEC cards, for example, pitch cards, or sign language like Makaton, making sure that you are keeping the communication to a minimum, that it's very clear, it's very specific, that you're not bombarding them with questions or expecting them to make any decisions. If you're sitting there thinking, something's up, are they about to have a meltdown or a shutdown? There are a couple of questions you can ask yourself. So, has something unexpected occurred? Has something changed? Has something been cancelled or moved, or, you know, something out of routine that might have thrown them? Are they fidgeting or stimming more than usual? Do they seem anxious? And by anxious, I think it's important to acknowledge that we think of anxiety as worry, don't we? Like, if someone's anxious, we imagine that they worry all the time, and they're contingency planning and thinking about, what if this happens and what if that happens, and they seem a bit scared and nervous. But actually, anxiety can also be demonstrated as intense irritability and anger, frustration. And we forget that sometimes, that if somebody seems suddenly irritable, or you tell them that, oh, guess what? Grandma called, she's going to come over tonight and bring some donuts. And the child's response is less than pleasant or less than receptive. You have to think about why. And is it because grandma's got that really yappy little dog that she always brings with her? And, you know, the fact that they're being irritable doesn't mean they're horrible. It might be them telling you, no, I don't like it when people, you know, come at the last minute. I hate last minute guests. Someone just dropping in and knocking on my door, I'm more likely to hide. I mean, I'm the sort of person that when my phone rings, even if I know who it is, you'd think a bomb was about to go off, and I kind of literally put a cushion over it or turn it on silent, because I really struggle to pick up the phone. So anxiety can be reflected in lots of different ways. And that defensive reaction is because something's happened to make them feel uncomfortable, and you need to try and unpick that rather than judge them for the defensive reaction. Another thing to ask yourself is, do they seem especially tired or overwhelmed? Because particularly with the school week, I know by Friday, and given like the after school activities and clubs that my boys do, they do get to that point of just absolute saturation, when they are really, you know, like cross with each other and irritable and much more likely to have a fight. And so we have to find ways that help both of them calm. Remember that stress tank and that narrow tap at the bottom, and what can we introduce to them that's going to help them kind of calm and relax and de-stress from a busy week at school. If you've answered yes to all of those questions, or even just some of those questions, you could be looking at a meltdown. Now, the actual diffusing of the meltdown is really critical. Of course, you need to remain calm. When my oldest was getting restrained at school when he was 4 and 5, I mean, it completely broke me. I was beyond devastated, and I didn't understand it. I was furious, and I was told that it was their behaviour policy, but I'd never seen that policy before, and I didn't agree to it. And I think we can rush into the idea of, if the child is acting up and screaming and shouting or trying to run off, that we restrain them. We think that's what we're going to do. We're going to calm them down. And actually, often for an autistic person, restraining us is the worst thing you can do. So it is about remaining calm and assessing the wider situation. And actually, is there anything in that immediate space where they are, where they could harm themselves or cause harm to others? And I mean physical harm. Ideally, you want to relocate them to a safe, quiet space, another room, for example. But if they are in an extreme state of distress and not cooperating with moving, then there are going to be times when you have to remove the other people from the room. And in fact, when my oldest was at school, I've had calls before where they said they had to evacuate the playground, and where they had to evacuate the classroom because his behaviour was creating risk for other children and he couldn't be moved or wouldn't be moved. In terms of talking to them, from your experience that if somebody talks to you in a raised voice or has that tone in their voice that they're cross with you or they're angry with you or you're doing something wrong, that you don't feel cooperative. So the more kind of calm and unemotional and practical you can keep the conversation. So let's go somewhere quiet where you can sit down, everybody's looking, come away, a nice way of transitioning them and letting them take, if they have like a favorite toy or some type of comforter that they like to have with them, that they can take that with them. Both my boys at infant school, their school was great in the fact that they had a tent outside the classroom, so that if they had a meltdown, but also as they got a little bit older, they started to be able to self-regulate better, because if they were feeling overwhelmed at that intensity of being in the classroom with all of those other kids all at once, 30 in a class, they would ask and be able to go to their tent and just retreat and have that 5-10 minutes time out, read a book, play with some fidget toys or sensory toys like the Orbeez, the water beads, or stress putty is really good, or Lego actually, to give that physical input. But those type of things in the safety of their tent with no one else around was very, very positive and healing for them. And when you have got the autistic person in a safe space away from everybody else, if there are things that really help them, for some people it's very regulating to eat like a really crunchy snack, or that they get really, really thirsty when they've had a meltdown, so you bring them a cup of their favorite, a big cup of water or some squash with ice cubes in, because then they can crunch the ice cubes. That's very sensory. It might be that they really enjoy looking at old family photo albums, or that there's particular music they love to listen to that helps them calm down. But all of these things will enable the individual at their own pace to come out of that intensely overwhelming, uncomfortable, frightening space into a space where they can calm down and actually start to communicate with you. Now, in terms of coping with the aftermath, of course, we have to be realistic about, based on age and cognitive ability, how much the individual is able to understand about what went wrong and what they could do differently and what responsibility they can take. Very young children, of course, not going to have the same understanding of repercussions as an older child. Children who are autistic with a learning disability may not have the same ability to regulate their own behaviour or to walk in another person's shoes. And then, of course, if the individual isn't verbal and you're requiring some other method of communication, that can make it even more trickier to get to a place of mutual understanding. The important thing is to not blame or judge. What you want to do is to check that they're okay. How are they feeling? What went wrong? You know, they were very, very upset. So can they tell you what happened? Because you want to be there for them and you want to help them find a solution. Remember that water tank, the meltdowns happened, but the stress is still there. It's full. And it's in that picking apart and trying to work out, and using your observation skills, because they're not always going to be able to tell you, either because they don't have the communication skills or the cognitive ability, or because emotionally they're really confused. And you know, my 10-year-old is very, very bright. He excels in everything at school. He's like top in everything, but emotionally he understands intense excitement and euphoria, usually brought on by some sort of sensory experience, and like hot red anger, and all of the other emotions, more subtle emotions, like sadness or rejection or jealousy or pleasure, you know, all of those type of things, they're like shades of grey. And trying to pick that apart with him, I mean, you can use an emotions wheel, that does help, but it's still really tricky. So being able to use your own observations and understanding to talk to them about and suggest ideas is a really, really good thing. What you want to do is, working together, try and have an idea of, if this happens again, what we're going to do about it. What can I give you? Where can I take you in the house? Or if this happens out in a busy shopping mall, where can we go? Even better, avoid the busy shopping malls. I see, since I got my diagnosis, I just don't do big group situations anymore. I don't put myself in that situation. But if there are times when your child has to be in those different situations, then what can we do to make that more bearable? Where can they go? And try and agree for both of you, like a mutually supportive strategy that helps minimize the impact of the meltdown and reduce the chance of them happening further forward, moving forward. Right, I've done a lot of talking, so I'll give you a pause here for breath. What we've done for this particular webinar is we've put together some questions that we would typically be asked when we run this course, either face-to-face in person or over Zoom, so that we can get a bit of dialogue and chat going. So we've kind of picked 4 or 5 questions that we think you might find really, really interesting, and I'll try and answer them for you as best I can. So question 1, what advice can you give about moving someone out of a situation during a shutdown, especially when there are others around, for example, a school lesson? So I guess the first thing I would say there is that, in my experience, shutdowns happen more at home, because that's our safe space, where our stuff is and where we feel comfortable to close in. But that said, there will be times, particularly in school, where they feel so overwhelmed that they do just need to close off. And I've actually had to go and my eldest is in middle school at the moment. He's got 1 more year to go. But last year they called me up because they said that he'd had a brilliant day, but they'd been, I think it's, you know, there's certain times of year, either they're putting on a play or sports day, there's lots of extra transition and things to focus on. And they said that he seemed really a bit overwhelmed and detached. And they'd set up a corner of the classroom with bean bags and a little bookcase and stuff that was behind a screen, that if ever things got too much, he could go to. So they let him go there. And when they checked in 5 minutes, he was asleep. And they were like, oh, you know, this is really weird, he's asleep. And I said, he's listening to his body, and his body's telling him enough, and let him shut down. So I guess if this happens in school, the individual, because remember what you need in a shutdown, you want isolation, you want to be in a safe space. you want to be quiet, you want to be calm, you potentially want to engage in your special interest, that I think if you notice that someone seems completely overwhelmed or panicked and has just gone very, very quiet, that gently guiding them to a quiet space within the school, ideally they'll have a sensory room, or some type of pastoral area, or even a quiet corner of the library where they can go and be quiet and calm and have a bit of breathing space. But given that a shutdown is not normally a fast thing, it's not like you have 5 minutes of quiet and then you're out of it. Normally what I would expect is that they should ring parents and ask them to come and pick them up and take them home, so that they can have that downtime, quiet time, retreat in their safe space like they're meant to. That is what I think would work best. Question 2 is, what advice can you give about my young person, 7 years old, who becomes upset if I ask or tell them to do anything, or if I say no to their request? So this is very common. You may have heard of pathological demand avoidance, which is a kind of an individual profile within autism. Sometimes people get a diagnosis where it's like autistic spectrum disorder, PDA traits. Now, actually, my observations, having met hundreds of parents and young people with autism over the last few years, and through my own experience and knowing my sons really, really well, is that I think most autistic people have a degree of demand avoidance in them. It's because we do like to be in control. And so if somebody tries to tell us what to do, or we feel like they're bossing us around or making decisions for us, then it does make us feel very defensive and attacked. And this is also why, do you remember I said about the slower processing speed, and that if you ask us to make a decision and we're thinking about it and you expect a decision straight away, by forcing it upon us, what you'll probably get is a no. And I can think back really clearly now, like in the past, the things that have caused conflict between me and family members is when they've made, outside of my immediate family, is when family members have made requests of me, and just assumed that I would do whatever they wanted, and that to them it wasn't a big ask, but to me it was. My automatic response would be no, because they never gave me time to think about it. It might be that if I'd had time to think about it and work out how I was going to fit that into my day, and within my routine, that the request would stop feeling like a demand, a threat, something that I didn't want to do, and I'd work out how to make it manageable. But by trying to force it on me, I'd automatically give the no response. So this is even more tricky when thinking if a young person, a child, is only 7. They haven't got those same degree of processing and reflection skills. So I think there are a few little things that you can do. If you know that they get upset about being asked to do anything, or about often it's because it's to do with transition. So they don't say they're playing on the iPad and it's time to get ready for bed, or they're watching a cartoon on the telly, or they're doing some painting in the morning and it's time to get dressed for school. That transition in the movement between tasks in itself is really, really tricky, because we like to finish what we're doing before we move on. So using timers, sand timer is a really good one, because it's quite sensory, watching the sand drain through as well. And just time warning. So with my boys, I'll open the curtains in their room at 7, and then I'll say, time to get up in 10 minutes, boys. And then after 5 minutes, I'll go in and say, come on, lazy bones, 5 more minutes, snuggles, and then it's time to go in the bathroom. And then after another 4 minutes, I'll go in and say, right, come on then, who's ready to be tickled? And because I've done that kind of slow build, they still nag and moan about having to get out of bed, but it works much more effectively than me steamrolling into their room in a panic, saying, come on, we're late, get up. All that does is cause me stress and cause them stress. So time warnings for any type of activity really help. Also, if you're saying no to their, if you need to say no to their request, so we've had this with our oldest. He's very into like YouTube and apps in the app store for his iPad, and he's often pushing the boundaries a little bit of what he can have and what he's allowed to play. But I've learned that it's really important not to just say no, that if he makes a request about something, that we look at it together and we look at the content, we look at if there's a cost, we look at the suggested target age for it, and then we might make an agreement. So for example, he's teaching himself the piano at the moment on an electric keyboard, and he's doing a month's free trial of Simply Piano, and he wants us to then pay for it at the end. And we've said, if you are practicing every day and you get good and you're still really enjoying it at the end of a month, then yes, we'll pay for it. So I think it's about, we'll find the money for it. I think it's about being flexible and pausing before we say no. It's about making time, giving a considered response, and for them, giving time warnings before they have to transition between activities. Question 3 is, how do I support my child to reduce their anxieties around specific things, for example, dirt or germs, as the presence of this often causes meltdowns? So this one has become really common, particularly with COVID, because our children have become so used to seeing people wearing masks in public, constantly having to wash their hands at school. There's pictures everywhere, isn't there, about germs and COVID, and they may have had to go for COVID tests and have the swabs put down their throat. It's all quite intimidating and scary. I think the thing with our children is that we need to empower them with information in a child-friendly way. So social stories work really well for autistic children. Normally your local library will have a pretty good range of social stories of different situations that autistic people might find tricky, like first time you go to the dentist, or how to deal with grief, or how to deal with lying, talk about lying, learning about lying and why we shouldn't do that. So with the dirt and germs, it's about, and actually there is quite a lot of good material that the government has worked with. I've seen I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but Axel Scheffler, who was the artist for Julia Donaldson's Gruffalo storybook, he's actually worked with some doctors to put together a really nice explanation to children about COVID and what the things are to do, and so that they can put their fears in context and it doesn't get out of control. And you do have to be able to keep talking about it. The worst thing you can do is downplay it and say, oh no, there isn't any dirt there, there's no germs, no, don't worry about that, that's fine, you don't have to worry about it, because the anxiety is still there. You have to address the anxiety, and you can do that by educating in a child-friendly way and empowering them, so giving them their own little bottle of antibacterial gel to keep in their school bag that's very sensitive on their young skin, that kind of stuff, so that they don't have a meltdown. Question 4, my autistic child puts themselves at risk during meltdowns, for example, running into roads. What are your views on restraint in these circumstances? So I said earlier that I'm really not comfortable with restraint. I don't believe, particularly in a school scenario, that it should ever be necessary. Having said that, of course, if the child is doing something where they're putting themselves at significant risk, I don't know, maybe they've climbed out of their bedroom window and they're sitting on the window ledge, or they are about to run into the road, into traffic, then of course you are going to need to safely restrain them, not restricting any, head or neck, and just safely holding on to arms. A tight hug or cradle scenario can work. I do understand that there are going to be intense situations like that when restraint is the only option to keep them safe, but I think it's more important about understanding why are they having the meltdown, and what can you do to reduce the chance of that happening when they're out in public. And because you can't remove or reduce roads, can you? And we can't keep our children inside all the time. So we have to understand, what is it when we're out and about in the street, in public, why are they having the meltdowns? Is it because you know when you get those idiots that drive by really, really fast in their boy racer cars or motorbikes, and it's like 1 minute it's just steady traffic, and then the next minute there's just this onslaught of noise and the horrible smoky traffic fume smell. And my youngest finds that upsetting. So it's like, maybe ear defenders would help them feel a bit calmer. Or is there, you know, some kids travel much better if you let them take their bike out or their scooter. They learn road sense much better than if they're walking. If their body is getting some kind of like, because they're having to concentrate on learning to ride the bike or learning to ride the scooter or keeping themselves safe, they get much better at, you always pause at roads, stop at people's driveways and look in case any vehicles are coming. That kind of thing can help them be a bit more responsible for themselves. But yes, I do understand why restraint would have to be used in that circumstance. I just want to try and avoid the situation in the first place by understanding what triggers their meltdowns when they're out like that, and how you can reduce or remove the problem. And then question 5, what are your views on restraint of an autistic child during meltdowns? Are there any circumstances which you feel may justify or necessitate it? And if so, do you have any advice on doing so in a way that causes minimal distress? So I really strongly believe that unless the autistic child is harming themselves, I don't know, they've got hold of a sharp or dangerous object, or they're going to hurt you, I don't know, they've picked up something really heavy, a big rock, and they're going to throw it and they're going to hurt someone, or they're going to smash a window, unless there's genuine risk of harm in that moment, then I think retreat and observe and stay calm and keep them safe by removing the risk factors, taking away the things that they could hurt themselves with, asking the other people to leave the room, is much, much kinder and productive. All you do over time by restraining an autistic child is you create trauma. Neurotypical people, whether that's a parent or a teacher, in my opinion, they have an inbuilt sense that they need to get control of a situation. If a situation feels out of their control, they want to control it because they're the adult or they're the professional and that's what they're meant to do. But you can't control an autistic child in a meltdown. What you can do is give them space, keep them safe, keep everything calm, remove dangers, and wait for them to calm down. That's the best way that you can do it. In the absolute necessity that you needed to restrain because they were either banging their head against a wall and you can see they're going to really injure themselves, or I can't imagine a situation where that you can't remove other people because they're at risk to other people. But only then would I see safe restraint using proper accredited techniques where somebody has had proper training would be necessary, and restraint should be kept for the smallest amount of time possible. Often, I mean, for any of you that have ever restrained through necessity, you'll know that 9 times out of 10, it doesn't calm them down. It makes things worse. And particularly as children get older, they're really strong. And by restraining them, you create that fight instinct where, you know, it's almost, you think that they've got like superhuman strength because they're fighting against you. And I remember my oldest biting a teacher and the headmistress sending me a photo of the teacher's arm with a big bruise on it. But there were 2 adults. He was 5 years old. There were 2 adults, one sitting either side of him, putting their legs over his lap and holding his arms. And so he did bite her. And I probably would have bitten her if I'd been in that situation, to be honest. So it's not easy supporting an autistic child in a meltdown. And I appreciate that our teachers work really hard to do the best they can, as do our parents. But the safest way to help a child through a meltdown is creating distance, support and allowing them time. And that's it for today. So before you switch off your computers or your laptops or your tablets, you'll see that the link in the video, there is a link in the video description that you clicked on today that will allow you to access the downloadable slides, so that if you want to keep a copy of the slides from today, either to print off or just to keep in a file on your computer, and that's available to you. Also, and even more importantly, there is a link to a digital feedback survey. And we would really appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete that. It's literally just a handful of questions, but it's invaluable in helping us shape future training to get your feedback. So if you could just, before you finish off today, have a look at the slides if you want to download them and complete the feedback link, then we will be very, very grateful. If you have any questions once you've watched this webinar, please do get in touch. As I said, we are Aspie Trainers working on behalf of Coastal West Sussex Mind. But we're happy for you to get in contact with us directly. We have a Facebook page, we have a website, and we'd love to hear from you. If you want to join our mailing list and find out about other training that we offer, then please do. Thank you so much for your time.